Alright, it's time to rate every episode of Velma Season 2. In my last video about Velma, I gave it a completely fair review, but also said some things that I wanted to see get fixed in Season 2, like the weird humor. Their definition of humor was talking down on white people and men, and trying to take these strong societal stances, which really made it confusing when trying to pinpoint a target audience for the show. If Velma Season 1 toned that nonsense down and focused on solving the mystery, then I could have given it a higher rating. So I'm looking to see what Season 2 entails and how or if the show got any better. So yeah, it's time to get in here. Episode 1, The Mystery of Teen Romance. There's a lot going on in this episode, but really, all of the chaos stems from two central plot points. The big one is that after the murder of Sheriff Cogburn, there's a new murderer in town, so that puts everyone on edge and gives Velma another mystery to solve, to which she's feeling more confident about her mystery solving skills now that she has a dub under her belt from the last season. Also in this episode, as the title would suggest, Velma and Daphne struggle about them because Daphne's under the assumption that there's this sort of love triangle dynamic going on with Norville in the mix. Thankfully, this wasn't the case. Love triangles make every show worse. On the surface, this could have been a solid episode. Like, all of this is some really good stuff, but it goes all over the place at a breakneck pace, with spending like 1 or 2 minutes on Velma and Daphne, then spending 1 or 2 minutes on Fred grieving over his mother and beefing with Norville. Then it's Velma trying to dig up Fred's mother to see if she's still alive and if she's causing the murders, and Velma has to deal with the repercussions of that. Also, there's the introduction of a new character, Amber, and they need a few moments in this episode. I applaud this episode for being void of the stuff that made Velma Season 1 cringe, like the societal stuff. But I had to watch this episode another time just to get all of my notes and fill in the blanks when I can usually get all of the information that I need in one sitting. The episode is convoluted and has too much going on at a herky-jerk, blink and miss it pace rather than being more structured with their storyline, so it's going to get a C+. Only gets a plus because they had some decent storylines. Just would have been nice to see them within a good structure. Episode 2, Creaky Friday. This episode follows up on the murder of Mr. S, which happened at the tail end of last episode. Basically, what happens in this episode is that there's more mystery solving, trying to get to the bottom of the person that was in the ghost costume at the police station, because that's probably the murderer. That's the main idea. All of this while the Creaky Friday event was going on. It was about oiling doors as a fundraiser for the school. I like how the Creaky Friday stuff had some relevance to the plot, with Velma rigging the draw and trying to get paired with Fred to get more information. Also, there was Daphne and Amber finding the bodies of the murdered men because of Creaky Friday. The Creaky Friday event was definitely better than stuff like Fog Fest and the marching band sleepover for sure. It's a plot device just like them, but they toned down some of the shenanigery that those episodes had and just got to the point, so that's nice. But something that I have to knock this episode for is its unpleasantness. Like, when they found the bodies of Cogburn and S, they had their wieners cut off, so that's nasty. Also, another squeamish moment was when Norville was still having hallucinations about Fred's mother and she drilled into his eye, so that's not nice. Also, speaking of Norville, I was able to find some level of interest in what everyone else had going on, except for him, when he was just trying to talk to the brains for most of this episode. His sections really bogged this episode down. This episode is going to get a B-. Could have got a B, but most of the Norville stuff is going to hold back what was a good and cohesive episode for the most part. Episode 3, When Velma Met Money. In this episode, Velma gets to experience living the rich life after she finds her mother and Fred's father having somewhat of an affair. At first, Velma doesn't like it and wants no parts of it, but then she makes a deal with her mother that if she wins the science fair, she'll break up with William. But as the episode went along, Velma started liking the rich life until she didn't, and it didn't align with her morals. Speaking of the science fair, Norville also wants to win it and show to his father that the grass is working to get rid of his hallucinations. Not a ton to say about this episode. I love that it's simple and to the point, but I don't love that I was basically watching an episode of Pokemon Orange Islands right here. Just filler. There's really no talk of the mystery that's going on, and they just focused on Velma being rich and the science fair, which were all right, but not amazing. I'll give it a C+. I didn't get much of anything out of this episode, but it was easy to follow and it wasn't infuriating like some other episodes that came out of this show. Episode 4, Seance. Last episode, Mr. Rogers gave the main characters detention, so in this episode, they showed up to detention and tried to perform a seance for a few different reasons. It was to try and summon the ghost of Victoria Jones to show Fred that his mother was innocent. Also, Norville was hoping that it could help him out in some way to see if he's haunted by a ghost. But for Velma, it was about exposing Amber and trying to frame her for this magic stuff being fake, and she wanted to get Daphne back on her side because they had been drifting apart because of Amber. This is an episode that had the makings to be alright, like they were going to detention on a Saturday. I've seen that work out before in The Breakfast Club, which they referenced a bunch of times, but they didn't really parody it. Rather, they fought against those 80s tropes over and over and over again. Like, okay, I get it. You're not a fan of The Breakfast Club. Move on and stop drawing this stuff out. Also, Velma was insufferable in this episode. She was very selfish, and there were moments that were meant for a laugh, meant for a chuckle, but no, she's trying way too hard in this episode. So on top of the fact that this episode wasn't entertaining, it also barely had any plot relevance until the tail end when Norville found Mr. S's papers from the asylum, and since he saw his grandmother's name rearranged into another name, he thought that she was still alive. But outside of that, like I said about the last episode, more filler than Hannah Montana Forever and Livin' Maddie, Callie style, man. Get this filler off my screen. I don't mind filler sections in episodes, but I don't have a whole 25 minutes, now 50 minutes to dedicate to watching mostly filler content. The fact that there are 2 filler episodes back to back just feels like lazy writing, like they had their end goal in mind, but they didn't have an interesting enough setup to fill 10 episodes, so that's why these filler episodes exist. Anyways, this episode totally deserves an F grade. I'm here for the mystery. Focus on the mystery. Episode 5, Burning Woman. This episode was about the townspeople trying to burn Amber down because Velma said on social media that they're the murderer, based on some very flimsy evidence. Some mystery solver she is. While on Norville and Daphne's side, they were able to find Edna and this little operation that she was running in secret where she took the brains out of people so they could discover their true selves. That was much more interesting than whatever Velma had going on. I wanted this show to move away from the politics and the mockery of certain types of people, but no, they're bringing it back. When there was this riot to try and burn down Amber and Velma was trying to stop it, Velma kept on trashing Americans by saying stuff like Americans would rather destroy anyone that points out their delusions than admit that they're wrong, and the only thing that Americans hate more than being told they're wrong is learning that they've been lied to. I said it last time and I'll say it again. When stuff like this is said, it really brings into question what the target audience for this show even is. Last season, they went after all the white people, and men. Now they're going after Americans despite this show being described as an American adult animated mystery TV series. At least try to be comedic, but these aren't even jokes. It's just using the show as a platform to push an agenda, so that's a turnoff. And yeah, the whole thing was dumb with trying to get Fred's father to pay everyone to leave, but he couldn't hear them because never tell rich people how to spend their money. Also, there was Velma editing pictures of the victims to have big wieners and showing that to the writers, so if they stayed, they'd either be at risk of getting murdered or they'd be admitting that they have small wieners. This stuff might be funny for like a 12-year-old, like a middle schooler or something, but no, this stuff just isn't hitting like how they thought it would. What Daphne and Norville had going on was much more interesting. This kind of reminds me of episode 4 from last season, Velma Makes a List, when Velma and the popular girls were talking about misogyny and trying to take a societal stance, while in the background, Norville and Daphne were trying to find Daphne's parents. Maybe this episode could have got a higher grade if the plots weren't just about evenly split, but the Velma nonsense is going to take this episode down to an F. That stuff is just so not funny. Episode 6, Private Velmjamin. This episode was mostly about Velma and Etna, now in Daphne's body, trying to get more solution, more glutamine for the brains that Etna was holding so that they can stay intact. I've got to say that this episode had a nice heist type of feeling, with Velma sneaking through the military base to find Etna's old place to get the glutamine. Stuff like that involving stealth is always going to earn extra points. Also, Velma was able to find out that Project Scooby was still up and running and being kept secret, which was Etna's plan all along with having Velma go there. The Velma plot was actually good for once, instead of being about taking a societal stance and trashing on a certain demographic. But everything else didn't necessarily weigh this episode down, but it definitely didn't add anything special, like Norville taking care of the brains and telling them to make a potential bucket list, and Fred trying to figure out the person that he mysteriously met, and Daphne's brain getting taken by a bunch of roaches. I really didn't like that last one because I can't stand roaches, so seeing most of Daphne's sections get dedicated to that was a turnoff for sure. Really unfortunate because the Velma plot was good, surprisingly, like it was actually about solving mysteries and advancing the story more, which is a nice return to form after episode 3 and episode 4 meandered around so much. Like the story is finally picking up, but everything else around Velma wasn't interesting enough, and the show dipped in quality when they kept on cutting away from Velma to everyone else. This episode is gonna get a B grade. It was fine, but it had potential to be better. Episode 7, Female Utopia. After the murderer revealed themselves to be a woman, Meryl was elected as the sheriff, and all of the women got moved to the crystal mines to protect the men and make it easier to figure out the person that was the murderer. Also in this episode, while out of her body, Daphne went on a journey for self-discovery and got her body back, and Fred and Norville had an argument about their relatives. Fred wants Etna to be dead so that she can be a ghost and her spirit can possess his mother, and that's how she became evil, rather than naturally being an evil person. While Norville wants Fred to stop holding that over his head because Etna is actually still alive, and getting Fred to believe that will get rid of his hallucinations. I really like what everyone has going on here, like all of it was important to the story. But whenever Velma is on the verge of having an episode that can earn an A grade, it always gets in its own way with its cringe comedy. At least they stayed away from the politics, but in this episode, more than any other episode, Velma was trying so hard to sound cool, like the audience was supposed to side with her, but I just couldn't. I just wanted her to stop wasting time on that stuff and just get to solving the mystery. Like, she single-handedly brought down what could have been an A tier episode to just a B. Everything was good in this episode except for the main character of the show, which is very inexcusable, and because of that, this episode is very lucky to be receiving a B rather than a C- or a D. Episode 8, Amon Hunt. This episode follows the end of the last episode when Amon, Velma's father, became a person of interest in the case. This episode was a mix of Velma trying to get back at Daphne for cheating on her, or so she thought. Then there was Amon leaving house arrest and stealing a flash drive that could contain some useful information relating to the case. The Velma and Daphne relationship stuff is getting so drawn out now. I really wanted them together, but I don't like how this stuff has been taking a big section out of these past few episodes and basically splitting time with solving the mystery. Also, this episode was so cringe. There's Fred trying to campaign to people that hooking up is not more important than going to an amusement park. Then there's Velma that was cringe all episode, but I just had it with her near the end of this episode when they were talking about the mystery and looking through these photos of her mother, and Velma asked if there were any candidates of her because they're great, and there's much more where that came from. There was a decent amount of information that was revealed about the murderer probably being a creation rather than a human, which was interesting for sure, but that can't carry this episode to anything higher than an F. Like I've been saying, it's cringe and the jokes that they're going for aren't funny. They just seem to be really out of touch, and with every joke, that bogs the episode down even more. Episode 9, The Real Villain. Funny enough, in 2020, I actually made a song named The Real Villain. Anyways, it follows the last episode when Velma was kidnapped by Scrappy, and he gave this whole rundown about how he was framed as the murderer by Don, so he wanted help getting his name cleared. And on the other end, Fred found out that his mother was an actual ghost instead of one of Norville's hallucinations, and she was trying to guide Fred in the right direction to be the man that she wanted him to be. I've gotta say, this episode was solid. There was a lot less clowning around and more mystery, which was actually a really interesting story, even if it all got unraveled at the end that the actual murderer was Scrappy. Also, after being such a wimp for the entire series and sulking over his mother for this entire season, I like that Fred stood up to his mother for once, like a grown man. Now, the inclusion of Scrappy was questionable, and when I first saw him, I was thinking like, why was he brought into this garbage based on how the previous episodes went? But I'm fine with it because I don't have this emotional attachment to any of the Scooby series. Like, it was a fine show to watch every now and then, but I never got into it, so there's one. But also, this doesn't ruin Scrappy because it's actually a solid episode, and even if he had a bad showing in this episode, one episode doesn't ruin a whole character. That's ridiculous. So yeah, in the end, I'm gonna give this episode an A grade. All that needed to happen was for them to focus on the mystery and for Velma to not step on her feet by talking about societal problems and looking to the audience to relate to her, and that happened for the most part, so good job. Episode 10, Till Death. Now all that's left is to find out the identity of Uncle Scooby, the person that was going to rescue Scrappy, and this was tough because Uncle Scooby told Velma that if she gets caught looking for him, then he's going to end her and her family, so that gave Velma the idea to brain swap with Daphne so she could continue looking for him. Uncle Scooby ended up being Sophie, and there was like this whole elaborate breakdown of her evil scheme, kind of like last season when Victoria Jones was explaining her motives, but I'll just leave that to the show to explain. The problem with this episode is that it's supposed to be this grand finale of the season and maybe even the show based on what happened at the very end of this episode, but between the double wedding stuff and the Velma-isms, like making Velma's life as Daphne good because of pretty privilege and vice versa, I just can't take this episode seriously like how it should have been for a finale. Really unfortunate that the season ends on a middling note after coming off its best episode of not only the season but the show overall. I'll have to give this episode a C, just too much clowning around. Velma Season 2 was a season that was supposed to be an upgrade. The animation and art style was already fantastic, and in the first season, they had a good mystery to follow. So what I was looking for was for them to stop making these terribly out of touch jokes and trying to take these societal stances and just focus on mystery solving. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. There was a 2-episode slot of complete filler, and I can't get that time back. And even as the mystery started to unravel in the later episodes, they just kept on dragging it down by making these cringy jokes. It tries to be comedic at the worst times, which probably wouldn't matter as much. I could give it a pass if the jokes were funny, but they're not. Like, it's tough for them to go an episode without taking a jab at some demographic or societal norm, and for a show that's about solving mysteries, I didn't sign up for that stuff at all. There was a large coalition of people that were unfair to the show by making up their minds, deciding that the show was going to be bad before they even watched a single episode of it, or saying that the show was bad but they didn't even watch the show. They only watched videos of people saying that the show was bad. And I can't forget the spreading of false information about what the show contained. I wasn't one of those people for sure. I gave this show a fair chance by not judging it on what it was able to show in season 1, but I gave it another chance. I gave it until season 2 because maybe the show could evolve, but that's not the case. And yeah, the show just is what it is at this point. I don't hate it, but I'm probably never going to go out of my way to watch it again. Like, I put a big YouTube project on hold and watched the Knuckles series late just to watch all 10 episodes of this, and I've got to say, I'm disappointed that I made that decision because it wasn't worth it at all. I might not cover a potential season 3, but that's the question. Is there even going to be a season 3? Because they ended Velma at the end of the finale. Like, she's gone. She's a ghost. Like, the show just went completely off the rails in such a short time, which is very ridiculous. But yeah, unless they revive her or they say it was all a dream, I don't know how this gets continued. It's like this got written knowing that this was the end of Velma. That's the feeling that I got from watching the finale. Doesn't make sense to continue it story-wise or reception-wise as well, so I'm interested to see the call, see if they're going to make another season. But yeah, that's what I have to say about Velma Season 2. I'm out.